All right. We are now live. Sorry for the slight delay tonight. Trying to get the kids in bed can be a bit of a challenge. So this is our first new attempt at doing some Mentionables content live. So bear with us tonight as we're probably going to experience some technical difficulties. And that is my co-host, who has just popped in. Let me add him on here. Welcome to the show, Joel.
I feel welcome. How are you, Caleb?
Wonderful. I'm glad to. I'm doing well.
Good.
You had a good Christmas.
So far, how about yourself?
I can't complain. Lots of it for sure. So, lots of time with family, though. It's been good.
Yeah, it's always a positive.
Yes, for sure. So, this is the first Mentionables live broadcast since Summit Live ended. And we're going to see how this goes. We don't have a set in stone format yet. So we'll kind of see what any viewers like or prefer as we kind of go along, see what kind of works out best as things go. It may be that we watch some video clips live and discuss at that point, or we may discuss weekly news events that are relevant to apologetics and go from there. I do want to go ahead and let people know that we are going to be doing a live Q&A. So if we do get any viewers or people asking questions in this stream, we will be able to see your comments and your questions. So please feel free to drop those in there, and we will answer those as we get into kind of the second half of the show. So as for right now, our format will kind of be, we'll have some impromptu news stories from the week that are at least relevant to apologetics, and we'll kind of discuss those and get our thoughts out on it, but not so much to necessarily give advice or tell you what to do about these things, but more so to look at the discernment piece of it. So what is a discerning Christian to do with some of these articles? How can they take them and turn it into a discussion that may be meaningful and valuable in everyday life? Or maybe, how do you get from this topic to talking about the gospel, the real key to things? So that's going to kind of be the format for this first episode, and we'll kind of move and groove as we go along.
You are killing this hosting thing.
Oh, well, thank you, Joel. I appreciate it. I've learned a lot from you, so there you go. Didn't find a killer soundboard yet to add on here to throw in live special effects, but I'm looking. Found one from The Office and a Star Wars one, so I thought about adding those in, but we'll see. Maybe down the road once we actually have some viewers for this.
Does it let you, make your own?
I found a couple that looked like they would do some of that, but couldn't find one on my initial research that was going to be simple and easy to do so.
All right. I love soundboards.
Oh, I know you do. I know you do. So, but we shall see. We may eventually have a soundboard. Let me check one thing here. I want to make sure. Oh, okay. Looks like everything is working. People can see us on YouTube at least. So once we have
that's cool.
Yeah, I know, right? So we could also do this as a live stream to Facebook if we find out we have more viewers who would watch there. So that would be another option for this. But I think since most of our content's on YouTube, that's at least a decent place to start.
Yeah, our two fans are on Facebook, so
Yeah, that's true. So, but we will see. So anyway, first thing I kind of wanted to discuss tonight as we're kind of moving into this, talking about news kind of thing. Let's discuss a little bit of the why behind this. I think that for me, I think it's important to discuss some contemporary issues that come up because a lot of Christians look at things the same way as everybody else does, but they often leave behind the biblical lens to look at things, or sadly, they even leave behind any kind of discernment or carefully reviewing issues. You do a lot of research, Joel. Why is discernment kind of key for things?
well, that's an interesting question. Honestly, I think within the church more than outside of it, discernment is really key because, at least in the research that I'm currently doing, it's this tendency that the church has to kind of withdraw from the world and isolate itself that has caused a lot of these problems. Because in this kind of isolationist environment, people, specifically young people, don't have the kind of exposure that they, well, honestly, that they desire or need to the outside world, and so they're restricted in their growth and development. Um, and so it's really, it's this tendency to want to kind of draw back like a snail in its shell and isolate itself from the world that Christians have. And I understand that impulse. As a parent, you kind of want to keep your kids away from all the terrible things you're seeing in the news, or at least Facebook news, if you can call that news. So it just
Propaganda.
seems, yeah, just seems easier to shelter them than to have to, you know, teach them to discern, to interact with the world that's around us in such a way as to develop healthily instead of just kind of adopting to whatever's going on. But they still need to get out there. They still need that exposure. So discernment might be the thing that we need to learn more than, how to homeschool or how to keep our kids locked in the church and, away from the world.
I would completely agree with you, and I think looking at things, especially on formats like Facebook or YouTube, it's very, very difficult to get an idea of what good Christian discernment actually looks like. And I'm not saying we're going to be experts at this all the time, but I think that in general, the examples we see are very quick to make a judgment on things and jump to conclusions that may or may not be relevant or even accurate.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I would say, again, I'm talking about children here because this is largely related to the research I've done, especially teenagers. Um, you know, like I said, the simple thing would be to kind of keep them isolated from everything, but they're going to end up going out there eventually. And as we talked about in one podcast episode we did, if you keep them away from everything and they just never see it, they're not going to build up any kind of discernment or capability to defend against that kind of thing. So rather than kind of replacing ACDC with Petra, if you get what I'm saying, um, you know, actually allow them to explore, allow them to ask questions, allow them to express doubts, allow them to have the freedom to think, to be a free thinker, and simply teach them how to think, how to learn, how to ask questions. And the other thing is, you have to be somewhat ecumenical, tolerant of ecumenicism, because there's a very good chance that your kid is going to go off and join those crazy Presbyterians and their pedo baptism and all that crap. But you got to be willing to live with that, and of course the one we always talk about is, your views of origins, creationism, and so forth, and your views on the end times. What do you call that?
Eschatology.
Eschatology. Thank you. Because if they somehow end up believing that there's going to be no rapture, you got to be able to live with that.
Right. And just to detour on this for just a second before we kind of go further with the topic, is that something you're seeing that has any listeners unfamiliar with kind of Joel's research, feel free to give a brief introduction into kind of your area of research right now, and is that something that you see as a factor so far?
So the things that I'm seeing most are, I've just talked about it, isolationism. This idea that you want to kind of keep them, yourself and your kids, away from Harry Potter and all that crazy witchcraft that they do, away from the world. And the evangelical church, since I've been in it anyway, has had this habit of trying to come up with replacements for those things that are popular. So we can't let our kids listen to that crazy rap music, so we got to make Christian rap, Christian hip hop. They can't listen to metal, so we got to make Christian metal. You get the idea, that kind of thing.
Right.
And also, we try to replace secular fiction with Christian fiction. The whole idea is to get them something to play with that all their friends are playing with, but is not of the world. I remember as a kid, the local Christian bookstore had a Christian version of Dungeons and Dragons. That was good stuff.
I hadn't heard of that one.
Yeah, it existed. I saw it myself. The coolest thing about that was that the 10-sided dice was, translucent plastic, and if you held it up to the light just right, it had a star that came through it, and they built that into the game, which was awesome.
I
never actually played the game because I didn't know anything about role-playing games when I was like 10 years old. I read the source books though.
Cool. Yeah, I know it's quite in depth to get into. So I admire people with that kind of time and dedication. I should have, if I wanted to go that direction with my free time, I probably should have started before I had kids, because the kind of time to sit down and do that now is rather limited, at least until they get a little older.
Well, I totally didn't DM a role-playing game group in my 20s.
Okay.
Back to the subject at hand.
Yeah. So,
because we all know that Dungeons and Dragons is witchcraft, and we're summoning the devil when we play it. So,
right, yeah, we could spend a whole episode going into the satanic panic and all the truth and the lies incorporated in that whole news media firestorm of things. That was
a fun section of history. And Chick Tracts. Don't forget Chick Tracts.
Yeah, they played a big part in it. So it's definitely interesting when you look at the history. But again, I think that's a great example of an area where we have to have discernment. I think as Christians, most people don't necessarily have the discernment to hone in on something like that and look at, okay, is the satanic panic something that was actually validated, or is it not? And even role-playing games, for that matter, many Christians, I think, would probably be okay to engage in some form and play these type of games. But then
it's very relieving to hear you say that.
Oh, absolutely. Granted, you don't have to take my opinion on these things, but I think that some people at the same time may have so little discernment that engaging in something like that may certainly lead them to explore other things that they're not quite prepared to deal with. So,
Mhm.
just like movies and music and everything else, I think a certain degree of discernment is really important.
Yeah, so I think that this this whole isolationism thing, it causes them to, kids, especially teenagers, to want to kind of go outside those boundaries. And when you've made a demarcation between, if you do this stuff, it's evil and you're not a good Christian and God frowns upon you or whatnot, and then they want to go and do those things, you've placed a unnecessary line in the sand that they're going to step across. And, in their mind, either I'm a Christian or I enjoy reading Harry Potter. Since I enjoy reading Harry Potter, maybe I'm not a good Christian, which is a ridiculous leap to take.
Right.
Um, and so, I mean, there has to be a level of freedom that we allow children, and then you grow up on this stuff and you're like, yeah, mom and dad just didn't understand. And then you're a mom and dad. And then your kids are listening to stupid bands that can't make real good music and watching stupid movies, all that stuff you don't approve of because you're old now.
Right.
But you know, you kind of got to let them, because being too restrictive and too isolationist can hurt rather than help.
Interesting. I look forward to hearing more about your research as it continues. I think it's an important area of study, and I think a lot of good will come from that. So,
Well, I've been doing like nonstop. If I'm driving in the car, I'm listening to one or the other type, and then I stop and I pull out the book that I'm reading and I read it, and then before we got on, I'm here on the internet doing a case study. So yeah, for every waking moment, I've been concentrating on this stuff, and
that's got to be pretty exhausting.
it gets to you.
Yeah, I imagine so. Well, tonight's probably not going to make you feel much better because we're going into some muddy waters.
All right.
So I want to briefly touch on a couple of kind of news topics from this past week, and we'll just kind of discuss them. Again, our goal here is not to give kind of a be all end all answer, but to really look at what kind of pieces do you need here for successful discernment? What should you be looking at? What should you be concerned about? What should you maybe rethink if your views become too focused in a certain area or certain issue? Before that, though, I want to throw out a plug. We had a major sequel put out in this last week to what is destined to become one of the greatest franchises of all time.
Frozen.
Not quite. Not quite. You familiar with Lutheran satire?
Yeah.
Yeah, they did a
I really enjoy that one video that they did.
Yeah, well, they
you
did
know
it.
The one.
Uh-huh. Well, the sequel hit this week. The sequel to Horace Royne's Christmas.
Oh.
So yeah, so listeners should check that out at some point. That's certainly fun.
I'm checking it out now.
Oh no, we could pull it up here. I think I've got the capability to do that.
Well, given that we have no listeners right now.
All right, we will. And this is also, I forgot to mention at the beginning too. This is somewhat of a test run. We haven't tried. We've done this kind of test in the background, but to really see how this goes, we've got to kind of give it a live run with real people in the chat and all that fun. So, Clinton dropped in the chat and let us know it's actually the second sequel. So it's now a full trilogy at this point. So, and hopefully we'll have one to look forward to yearly. So, anyway, that was my side note blurb before diving into kind of anything else. One of the big news stories.
Okay, there's been all these comments this whole time, and I haven't been looking at them.
Yeah, we've got some comments there.
All right, let's see. Hey John, if you're still watching, yeah, I said Dungeons and Dragons just because that nobody knows what Deadlands is, and I don't think we have the time on air for me to explain the role playing glory, which is Deadlands. So, Armor of God was really the name of the RPG, the Christian. Makes sense. All right, I was just responding to all these comments that I haven't read yet. So, and we're back.
All righty. Well, and feel free to do that at any time, Joel. I don't mind you diving in and getting to stuff I may have missed. So it's all good with as few of listeners as we currently have live, at least. It should be fairly easy to interact with some of the comments. So, the first news story from this past week, I kind of wanted to touch on from this angle. Are you familiar at all, Joel, with the Bethel Church in Redding, California? Can you still hear me? Uh-oh. Here's Joel has frozen. That's probably some payback for him mentioning Frozen earlier, and there he goes. He's gone for now. All right, so back to just me. I'm sure he'll rejoin us here in a minute. So the first news story I wanted to touch on this week was in regards to Bethel Church in Redding, California. They had a child in the congregation. I think it was actually a worship leader's 2-year-old who had passed away. Very, very sad situation in that this child had passed away at a young age. Let's see if Joel's back here. All right. Well, I'm just going to keep talking until there he is. Can you hear me now, Joel?
I can hear you now.
All right. And I can hear you as well. So what I was touching on is Bethel Church in Redding, California. They had a child in the congregation, a young child, 2-year-old, pass away this week. Or last week, I guess it is at this point. And the congregation decided to pray for a resurrection of this child. And the pastors put out a message on it as well, and said essentially, we're going to keep praying that this resurrection happens until we're not anymore. And it's a scenario that's definitely got people's opinions up and about within Christian circles, because it's not something every day you hear of is Christians praying for a resurrection of someone who's passed away. But I'm not going to open the whole Bethel can of worms, because there are certainly bigger questions there as well, in terms of what kind of level of discernment the leadership is kind of actually using there. But it is a very, very large church that's been influential in a lot of other churches as well, and their worship music has also been a major influence within a lot of churches, from my understanding. Did you hear at all about this story this week, Joe?
No, I don't know much about Bethel. I mean, it sounds familiar, but do you want to kind of give me some general idea?
Yeah, so it's very large. I don't have a count on the membership here, but I know that they run a school of ministry or school of prophetic ministry as well. So they're very charismatic, um, and
Yeah, that's
are
starting to sound
what's
familiar to me.
yeah, and they're what some would consider a kind of leading church in what would be considered the New Apostolic Reformation, which is, in short, a okay, you're mouthing things at me there. Is
I
a
don't want to say the C word, but
I hear you now. Yeah, it's it's heading that direction in a lot of ways, and I'll refrain from kind of going down that road just yet for sure. I don't have enough solid details that I would, stick a pin in that and say, yeah, that's what's going on here. But it certainly has some issues, and this most recent one has even raised more questions, due to the fact that they're praying for a resurrection of this child. Um, Given not having kind of the background on this situation and kind of following this story as much as I may have, um, any kind of initial thoughts on something like that?
well, in general, I find that any kind of prayer or expectation, I suppose, related to God coming in and fixing a big problem is a fairly certain recipe for disaster. I mean, we know that a lot of faith healings, if not all faith healings, have to be kind of faked. Um, because, this is not the kind of thing that one sees happening frequently. And I'm sure you are aware, as I am, that when you pray for God to just kind of come in and fix a problem for you, frequently that doesn't happen, at least not the way you're praying for it to happen and not immediately. Uh, and so, I mean, they've just dialed it up to 11 and decided to go ahead and pray for a kid to come back to life. Um, and I think that we have precedent in scripture to say that we're not, you know, supposed to have an easy life and that we will, in fact, have problems and we're going to die. You know, scripture doesn't promise us any kind of, easy solutions or health, wealth, and prosperity. What it promises is something in the future, let's say. I don't have to get into all of that, but my point in all of this is to say that when you promise people that if they do X, Y, Z, a miracle will happen, um, and then the miracle doesn't happen, you've set yourself up for failure, and also you're being unbiblical.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that's one of the major issues here is for leadership to embrace this. It's it really goes back to that lack of discernment we were talking about. It sets people up uh, for failure. We don't have any um, real evidence since the time of the apostles that resurrections are still taking place, in terms of being an actual gift that's still being carried out. Um, we have the instances of resurrection within the Bible are usually for a very specific purpose as well. It's not just, hey, I think we're gonna have a resurrection
Mhm.
today. It's not a common occurrence for a reason, because usually um, the
Mhm.
event has a strong, significant meaning tied around it as to why this has happened, as to why this person. Um, and another thing that struck me about the whole situation was concern for other families within the church. Is it's my understanding that this was a worship leader's child. I don't have confirmation of that, so I can't say for certain.
Mhm.
But I'm sure with a church, I looked it up, it's about 11,000 people go to this church. So I'm sure with that kind of size, this is not the first child or infant death they've had within the congregation. So,
Okay,
you
so
know,
this was a baby.
2-year old, 2-year old.
Oh, okay.
So very, very young. Um, and I'm sure that within that congregation, they've probably had other similar losses at some time. So, what kind of message does that send to parishioners as well, who may have gone through this loss in the past and now have the question of, okay, why was it important enough to pray for this resurrection, but when my child died, nothing was done about it.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you know whether or not Bethel preaches prosperity gospel?
The New Apostolic Reformation largely runs on a thin line. I've been reading a lot into the history. I'm lucky enough to have a good friend who spent a lot of his time for his master's degree in terms of researching the history of New Age. And I think what we see a lot is prosperity gospel largely comes out of New Age. And
Mhm.
then out of that, I think that New Apostolic Reformation kind of sets on the fringes of that, trying to still maintain a semblance of biblical teaching, but they're pulling in a lot of these ideas that come from prosperity gospel and that are, like you said, health, wealth. If your faith is strong enough, you're going to have these good things happen. You're going to be healthy. You're going to be able to uh, be better. But it's on kind of the fringes of hyper charismatic in terms of belief. So it's one of
I'd
those areas
like
that,
to. Uh,
yeah, yeah,
all right. There's two things I'd like to say in this regard. First of all, there's clearly a suffering family here. Somebody who has lost their 2-year-old. I mean, you have children. I can't imagine what going through that would be like. Um, and so somebody is grieving, and they've lost a child. That child will have no future. They'll be stuck with those memories. So it's important to keep in mind the human element here. It's not just a bunch of wackos out in the middle of nowhere doing something stupid spiritually. There's a suffering person here,
right,
suffering people, because I'm sure husband, wife, and then, or at least mother, father, and then those around them that care for them. So, I mean, in a sense, this could be a move of desperation. They dearly want to have relief to this pain and undo this tragedy that's occurred. And so, I mean, people who are desperate do desperate things. So, you know, that's important to keep in mind, because it's easy enough to, wave them away and dismiss, a bunch of crazy people doing a crazy thing. But there's a human being here, and that human being is suffering. And so that's important to keep in mind. Second of all, it seems to me that if you're going to preach prosperity gospel, at some point, you're going to have to run up against death. Because if you're telling people that, if they pray hard enough and read their Bible hard enough and just faith really hard, and, God will give them everything their heart desires, well, every single one of us is going to die. And so, when that day comes, which death is the best death that God could give us if we're really faithing hard? you know Death happens. It happens to everyone. 200 years old, somebody, you are going to die at some point. And, this is something that it seems to me is inescapable if you're going to preach prosperity gospel. And I wouldn't be surprised if this kind of desperation occurs when a leader is telling you, hey, you've been a really good Christian, and then something bad happens. Well, you must have done something wrong, because otherwise that bad thing wouldn't have happened to you. It's kind of like the Job and his friends syndrome. Bad things happen because you're a bad boy, uh, kind of thing, which is not the gospel.
Right, and that's one of the key ideas that's been kind of transplanted from New Thought, yeah, in the New Age, is that the idea is that there is only spiritual, and that what you're doing influences things, um, because there is only spiritual. So if you think the right thoughts and do the right things, then you can will uh, your physical manifestations of things to actually change, because you're really just a spiritual being. And that's where everything comes from, in terms of you connecting with this ultimate force of reality. Is it's all on you. So when the cancer strikes, when the illness hits, when the tragedy hits, it's your fault that it happened. It's not because in the Christian worldview, we see that stuff happens. The biggest claim from people is the problem of evil, in that it's all these
Mhm.
awful things that have happened, and this is why Christianity can't be true. Christianity has an explanation for that, has multiple good explanations that are probable, as for why the Christian worldview is actually the one that best fits into our picture of reality. But when you're looking at this kind of new thought idea that's present within churches like Bethel, it's that it's really what you've done that's influenced this to happen. And I do think that's a very, very dangerous idea. Not to mention the slippery slope that could be created from a place like a teaching like this to
Mhm.
New Age. It'd be a very very quick and easy path to follow. And I think that's my greatest concern with Bethel, is where they kind of lean on these things. But this particular event was concerning for some of those other reasons we discussed as well, because
Mhm.
it does have some greater implications, especially in terms of the psychological damage this could do, or the precedent it could set.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, the suffering person I've been speaking of, they're just, you know, throwing gasoline on the fire of that suffering. And when the kid doesn't come back to life, they've got to live with that for the rest of their lives. Rather than helping them cope with the pain in a healthy manner, they're doing something crazy.
Right. Right. No, I completely agree. So it's one of those issues that, you know, again, we keep coming back to this word discernment. I'm sure we're going to hit on it a lot of times over the course of this, but it's something Christians need to look at with a little bit of a skeptical eye when things like this come up. And you need to look at the teachings. If a church is praying for this kind of event, maybe we need to dig down, look at their teachings. What do they actually teach about the gospel, the good news of Jesus, not of present resurrection? Um, and really see what they're teaching at a base level.
Which would be nothing but resuscitation.
Right.
Because, if they pray really hard and the kid does come back to life, at some point the kid will die again. This is not the resurrection we're looking for.
Right. Right. Exactly. And even in watching, I watched the update their lead pastor Bill Johnson gave on this event, and again, it didn't bring out what the gospel really was. It was an explanation of, well, here's why we're praying for a resurrection, and But again, it didn't touch on kind of any of these issues we've discussed, and it certainly didn't bring the gospel into play. This was an opportunity to reach a lot of people because people were following this story, and an opportunity to even, get a message out there to a much wider audience than they even have now. But it just wasn't something there. So
Yeah, I always love it how when, a group of Christians out in the middle of nowhere does something really crazy, they get the attention. And then
mhm.
everybody in the world's like, "Okay, so that's a Christian."
Right. Right. And it's very often these kind of groups that a lot of us are still very, very much in question about or concerned about. I'm not here trying to indicate that they um, aren't necessarily believers, but some of their teachings are certainly very questionable and concerning.
Yep. 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 Yep.
So, to touch on kind of one of the next areas, if you'll bear with me 1 second here.
Sure.
The next thing I'm going to touch on is how about the story about Christianity today, and they're calling
Trump.
for Trump to be removed from office. Now, I don't want to dive,
Yeah.
we're not a politics podcast by any, or live stream by any
Ministry.
means. Right. But the way this issue has come up and been so prominent, um, I think it's something to at least touch on our thoughts as to how someone should approach this kind of thing. So I'll let you kind of dive in. I'll be back in about 10 seconds.
All right. So the basic thing is that the magazine Christianity Today, which has been founded, I believe, by Billy Graham, um, and has been sort of the staple voice of Christianity. It's like the Times Magazine of Christianity. And so they're one of the editors. I don't know where he lines in the hierarchy of the editing staff, but he put out an op-ed that suggested that evangelicals need to stop backing Trump, which is a fair point, and that they need to support the impeachment efforts to get Trump out of office. And so I didn't read the article. I couldn't tell you what his arguments were for that. And so I don't want to be critical of an argument I didn't read. Um, again, I think I've probably made it clear in previous podcasts, but as a Christian and an apologist, I try to remain apolitical. I do have political views, but I find that when one brings them into ministry, that this immediately is going to alienate somebody or other. And, I don't myself place a great deal of my hope and concern and energy onto the political sphere. And so, I find that that's probably unhealthy to do. Now, of course, our mentionable member, Clinton Wilcox, is a little more politically involved only because he's an advocate in the area of bioethics, which includes abortion, which is sadly a political issue. So he has to engage on that front. I don't, because that's not my field. Now, that's would be one thing that I would say about the article. In an ideal world, if I were running the magazine, I wouldn't get involved in the political end. In fact, I would tend to encourage my readers to become more active in the world as ministers of the gospel and less active in the world as, beating people with our, chosen political weapon. Now, that being said, because I haven't studied the issue, I haven't really sat down and given it considerate thought, I've heard arguments that said that, because Christianity has the power of influence, and because the what is it called? The two it's like an Augustinian thing where he wrote about the two churches or the two worlds or the two somethings or other, where he was talking about, Christians have to, move in two realms. They have to move in the spiritual realm and in the uh, civilization realm. And so, they have a uh, obligation both to God and to fellow man, which means to be involved in the political sphere as well. I don't have a firm position on that myself. I'm not, familiar with that philosophy, and I don't know enough about politics to take strong stands and to, tell people my opinion and what to do.
Right, and I think that's very fair, and I think you gave a good summary of things there, and I actually don't want to go down the route of looking at this from one perspective being right and one perspective being wrong.
Yeah.
Instead, I really want to look at if a listener wanted to go look at this more in depth and wanted to really formulate an opinion on this, what would be some of the steps you would kind of take, or I would kind of take, to begin to actually look at this more in depth? And then part two, um, coming away from that, if this comes up as a element of conversation for someone to talk about, what could they do to maybe take that conversation and move it in a more productive manner where they can talk about things like the gospel or like someone else's religious views, versus looking at kind of this political social media issue? So part one, though, where do they start to formulate an opinion on this sort of thing?
Well, I mean, because I'm a Christian and I'm not from a mainstream denomination, um, most of the people within my circle tend to lean right of center. And so typically, I would assume when somebody is on Facebook or Twitter and they see some article about an article that says that Trump should be impeached from a Christian perspective, chances are they're going to immediately disagree with the article based on its title. Um, I would suggest if you're going to criticize an article, read it first.
Right.
Don't just immediately jump to the assumption that the person who wrote it is a commie or a rainbow flag waving liberal or something like that. I mean, hear them out. Uh, that's what I would want to happen to me if I were to write an article. I would prefer people read the article and then form an impression before just jumping to a conclusion. But that's social media. We
Right.
read the title of the article and then we formulate our opinion on it. So that's just how things go. Second of
Yeah.
all, hey, we live in a free country. You know, Christians, atheists, and everybody in between have the freedom of conscience to make political choices and to vote their conscience and things like that. So respect that people have opinions that are different than your own. Um, Much easier to have a society in which we can have a civil conversation on it, something we disagree on, rather than formulating our opinions and our actions around some cognitive map that we've already formed. And to immediately, and online this is especially easy, to just demonize a person based on one thing they post that you disagree with, and you shove them into the camp of the faceless stormtroopers or the red shirts that get killed in the sci-fi movie, and we feel no regret about that because they're not really human.
Right.
We dehumanize the person because they're on the other side of a avatar on a screen, and they're not a real human being in our mind. Yeah, people
Yeah,
have
we
reasons for holding opinions. Hear them out.
I completely agree, and that was going to be a couple of my pieces of advice as well, was you know read what they're actually saying. In
Mm-hmm.
this case, I think there are a number of other factors you have to be familiar with as well. So, everything that's going on with the impeachment, why it is, like you said, what are the other opinions on this? And when you're looking at political issues, I think it's important to look at both sides of things, because otherwise you're very much going to miss out on pieces of information that may actually be important to forming an opinion about a given topic. And then,
Mhm.
like you also touched on with the editor, I think it's important to look at what's this person's, what is their level of discernment like. So, what do past articles look like when they're doing these op-ed pieces? Are they actually looking at scripture? Are they teaching from a solid Christian perspective? Or, have they veered off in other directions at times? What's their teaching like? Are they solid? There's somebody who has an opinion on something, so they should at least be having some level of discernment. And so if you look at that from a more historical perspective, everybody has an opportunity to change, but know who it is you're listening to, not just because it's necessarily a trusted source, but know about the person too. I encourage that for anything that, we put out as well. Know about us. Don't just trust what we're saying, um, but look at things. Give us a chance, either one way or another. Hate it or love it. You know, be somewhat critical of the people you're listening to, in terms of if they're teaching things that are actually true, or how often are they veering off the road down a path that they really shouldn't be going down. And again,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, a lot of the politically, there's not a great deal that we as citizens can do about the impeachment. Now,
Right.
technically, our senators are supposed to represent their constituents. So there is a process by which you can make your voice heard to your senator. I don't know how actually effective it is, but you know, um, in an old-fashioned world, you should have been able to call up your senator and tell them what your opinion was, and when they go on the floor, they should vote the consensus of their constituents. I'm not
Right.
sure if that's actually a thing that can happen, but technically they're supposed to be able to do that.
Right.
Um, so, what does it mean to support the impeachment effort? Well, mostly it seems to mean that we yell at each other online a lot. Because if we can like post enough memes and be mean enough to people that disagree with us online, I guess that's supposed to make it happen. I don't know. Um,
Right. That seems to be the mentality, is, throw enough social support behind something, and your effort's going to have a payoff. I don't know quite where that idea comes from. I guess part of the effort maybe is to uh, lose some of the evangelical vote in the upcoming election, is one possible motivation there, if we're looking at kind of a political drive behind it. Is don't give this person your vote down the road, even though it's about the impeachment. We've still got an election coming up.
Yeah, I
So, but
mean,
again,
which makes this whole impeachment thing seem a little ridiculous.
right. But it's politics, and sometimes they end up that way.
Yeah.
And that goes for every side of the fence, under the fence, over the fence, left, right, wherever people stand. It can be ridiculous sometimes.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
again, we're not taking this a political direction, but we want people to be able to understand how you go about approaching some of these issues. Many people are probably very good at this in terms of looking at both sides on things, but in general, what I encounter is barely reading beyond the headline, uh, barely looking at any kind of depth on any given issue and what factors are at play, and very rarely hearing the opposite opinion that's out
Mhm.
there on things.
No, of course not.
Right, right. So, what are your thoughts on how somebody should take this issue if it comes up in conversation? Let's role play this out a little bit. if you're in the workplace, and granted, some workplaces you aren't allowed to talk politics for certain congressional acts, but say you're in the workplace or at that New Year's Eve party, and this issue comes up. Hey, what do you think about this article? This is a big Christian publication that's finally condemned Trump. What do you think about this, or what have your thoughts been on it? How could you take that, even if you haven't, say, researched kind of background of this issue, and move that conversation in maybe a more productive way, where you do have a chance to talk about things of a nature of faith, but not necessarily even that topic?
Well, first of all, I mean, this is politics. We live in a free country, and I wouldn't encourage anybody to lie. I mean, if they've got an opinion and the person asked it, I don't see why they shouldn't share it. I mean, I respect the fact that people are capable of forming opinions and backing those opinions with reasons. And so if the person asks and you want to give your perspective, I don't see a reason not to. However, I would also give them the opportunity to give their perspective and hear them out. If this is a game of waiting for the other person to stop talking so I can tell them what I think, then it's not a productive conversation. From a Christian or apologetic perspective, I find it far more productive to do more listening and less talking. So, I mean, if somebody comes up to me and asks me my opinion on it, they've given me permission to talk, be honest. If you're me and you happen to have my own particular approach on things, then I told you what my approach is. I'm not particularly political. It's a free country. I trust in the democratic process to work out however it will. And when it comes time to go to the polls, I'll vote my conscience and we'll move on from there. But I find that discourse at the ground level is probably the better use of my time than arguing about politics that I don't have a lot of access to.
Right. And I feel a lot of the conversations I have with people, the ones that are most meaningful, is usually, I hope, to the other person, as well as I know for a fact to myself, are the conversations that really touch on deeper matters, and really drive at some of those elements of thought. So for me, I would agree with you in a lot of ways that I'm going to do a lot of listening here. Now, if somebody's come out and asked me my opinion in a case like this, where I may not have all the information at hand, and may not even want to discuss my political views in a given setting. So what I would probably do is I would utilize kind of a tactical approach and really ask questions to turn this conversation into something else. And this is not something as an act of manipulating it, or trying to pull one over on somebody. That's not this at all. But if I can lead that conversation in a more meaningful way, so that we both enjoy the conversation a little bit more, and so we get more out of it, then I think it's a win-win. And so for me, one thing I would do immediately if something like this came up is I would say, well, I don't really have all the information on it. So it's not a particular topic that, I would discuss in depth, or I haven't formed an opinion on it yet.
Mhm.
But it does raise an interesting question with regard to morality. What do you think of the morality in this situation, or what is your worldview say about morality, whether or not um, morality should have a factor in our political views? So I would ask somebody questions along those lines to begin really listening and learning what their view is about morality, and probably follow it up once they explain that, with how'd you come to that conclusion. um, all straight out of Greg Kokel's tactics, but I think you could take a topic like this coming up and move it to the realm of something like morality, that would certainly be more general, but it's going to help, explore an issue that is important versus kind of arguing over the political side of things. Let's look at morality. What do you believe about morality? Tell me about it. And then I'd do exactly what you said. I'd put on my listening ears and really try and understand where they stand on the issue of morality, and maybe even ask them, how their worldview affects that. If you believe in some kind of impersonal God, then, where does morality come into that? Or if you believe in, the Christian God, then why do you believe the way you do about morality? So that's kind of the approach I would use in kind of tackling that issue.
By the way, my comments are coming in about like 30 minutes after they were posted there. Clinton just reminded me that the thing that I was trying to say was the two books. You've got the book of the law and the book of the Bible. Hey, look at that.
There we go. That works. I was looking for an opportunity to do that, so to show that. So that worked. Very cool.
All right. So that was the thing I was struggling to remember like an hour ago.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Go back about 40 minutes in the episode, listen to that section, and then that'll make sense now.
Yeah, but what you're saying about morality. So if you're a listener to the podcast, then you'll have heard the teaser episode we did of a debate between Mark Lambert and a gentleman named Jeff Masty. And Jeff, as we discussed in that episode, is a political activist who uses street epistemology, this idea of trying to deconvert people, as his chosen form of political activism. And so he's an atheist, and he's very passionate about Trump. Specifically, he doesn't like Trump, and he doesn't like him passionately, which is a very common perspective on Trump. So
very much so.
But his chosen weapon against Trump is to try to deconvert people. So frequently when I have conversations with him, I have to ask him, okay, you are condemning Trump. Where are you getting the morality? Where are you getting the standards by which you're judging him, being an atheist and all? Mm-hmm. And so this is something he constantly has to struggle with in our conversations, because he moralizes more than any of the Christians he talks to. Most of his, and you get this with atheists a lot. They're like, how could you believe in hell and still believe in a loving God? How could you do this? Brainwash your children and etc. So they make moral judgments on Christians a great deal. And where are they coming up with these moral standards? So yes, talking about Trump, since apparently everyone has an opinion on Trump. And I do mean everyone, like in the world.
Pretty much. I'm pretty sure my kids may have an opinion because they occasionally mention his name, and usually it's associated with, what's the orange dude doing? And,
the Kool-Aid man.
Yeah. So like you said, everybody has an opinion on it.
Right.
But usually people have thought a little more in depth about where they get something like morality. Like you said, I think it's a good direction to take the conversation. Where are those moral judgments coming from? If you have such a strong opinion here, where do you get that from? And it's not to say that atheists are without morals. That's not what Joel is saying at all. At least I don't think so, right?
No, they have morals, strong ones. The question is, where are they getting them?
Right, exactly. And you and I would both agree that, those morals that they're experiencing and acting on are very, very real. In terms of,
I don't want to dismiss anybody's opinion on Trump. I understand that people hold opinions for good reason, and I'm not as them. All I'm saying is he's a divisive figure. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Caleb. Go on.
No. You clarified there. I think we're good. If anybody has questions about what we actually mean because we're not being clear at some point, feel free to drop comments in the comment section afterwards. We do try to respond to those as long as it's a manageable number. So, but I think you clarified that, and we're in good shape there. So those were kind of the two main topics I had, from the news this week that I wanted to kind of discuss and throw out there while we were waiting on any questions coming in. I haven't seen any questions hit. I'll kind of throw this out there one last time that if there are any questions you want to hear us tackle on live, we are certainly open to tackling some Q&A. That's kind of the direction I'd like to see this kind of go down the road is, have some live Q&A in this. And if we get enough viewers and can have it be all live Q&A, then that would be fantastic. I think it would be far more fun than listening to us discuss news for the week. But again, I think it's important that Christians look at discernment and how they're viewing issues and how they're studying issues and how they're taking these issues and using them to have more meaningful conversations than they may have up until this point. So, that is what it is. The last thing I was going to throw out here in between waiting for any last Q&As, which I see none at this point, assuming I'm seeing all the comments here, would be, is there any material you're reading, listening to, watching right now that has an apologetics application or meaning to you in whatever you're engaging with culturally?
Was that question for me?
Yeah. So I'll kind of go first to give you the idea for the kind of topic here. Is for example, right now one thing I'm reading is the new 10th anniversary edition of Tactics by Greg Koukl. So in terms of Christian reading material on the subjects of apologetics, this is kind of my first go-to with a lot of believers, because it really teaches you how to have conversations in a way that's graceful and winsome, and you can discuss these things that are very important for Christians to share. We believe that sharing that Jesus came to form a bridge between our failed relationship with God and to offer that path back to him through a bridge of that relationship through his sacrifice on the cross. We believe that sharing that with people is of critical importance, and it's something that we should always be have on our mind as to how we can share this. But we're living in a very different age where the gospel is becoming less and less known, and people aren't going to listen as well to strangers yelling at them on the street, or because they're used to it every day from the news stations and from YouTube. So if people aren't going to listen to that kind of thing, what will they listen to? Well, people love having conversations, and so Tactics really touches on how to have conversations with people, but it improves your conversations tenfold, in my opinion, in terms of, and not just in regards to the gospel, but all my conversations have improved after reading Tactics, because it's really taught me a lot about how to have more meaningful conversations that are really good and usually lead to other conversations down the road, because it's about building a relationship as much as it is about the topic you're handling at the moment. So that's one of the things I'm engaging with right now is going back through that, and it's certainly something I can't recommend more. I've also got a secular TV show that it has some spiritual leanings that I may bring up in a future episode. Right now, I'm waiting to finish it up though to see exactly where they're going with the spiritual nature of things.
You know, this is more mentionables business, but are you still thinking about doing an episode on Christian fiction and art and so forth?
Yeah, it's still on my to-do list. So it's something I just haven't had time to dive super into just yet.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I'm actually looking forward to that because um, it's a subject that I'm interested in talking about as well. So, but at any rate, so you want to talk about that show at some point in the future? Um, it'd be cool to bring it into that episode if we ever do it.
Yeah, true.
As far as material I'm currently engaging with, I really wouldn't recommend any of it to our listeners.
Fair enough.
The most spiritually uplifting thing that I'm currently reading is a book from 1901 called "Variety of Religious Experiences," and let's say it hasn't aged well.
Mm.
And
Sounds sleep inducing.
so it's comical to me because you get to hear somebody from 1901 uh, lecturing on psychology and talking about how religious mania might be induced by a slight disorder of the liver. And as a solution to that, you should take a brisk walk through nature.
Wow, that's interesting.
That kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
also, yes,
that's
sleep inducing.
wow. All right.
Sorry, this is part of
Well,
the research that I'm doing. I'm not just doing this for enjoyment.
oh, really? Really? I thought it had to just be, pure free time enjoyment for something like that. Um, all right. Well, we've had no other questions or no questions come in. Hopefully, if we gain a little momentum with this, we'll have some more questions
Still with
come
me?
in. Yeah, I'm still with you. You're getting a little dodgy there on me. All right. Well, uh, we've kind of covered everything that I had planned for tonight. So, um, kind of material. If you like this kind of, engagement, and hopefully we'll have some more listener interaction, this kind of thing, please just let me know in the comments as to whether this is something you like, suggestions for videos we could look at. Anything along those lines would be perfectly fine. Would love to hear any kind of feedback on this kind of content and what you want to see, what you enjoyed, what you didn't enjoy, um, and whether or not this was helpful in any way, shape, or form. So please feel free to engage with comments or look us up on Facebook, The Mentionables, or check out the website at thementionables.org, and engage with some of the material that's available there. Check it out. And again, feel free to interact. Would love to hear from people. Looks like Joel back in real quick so that he can wrap up and say goodbye to everybody as well. Can you hear me now, Joel? He's still frozen somewhat. Well, there he is. He's blinking now. We just wrapped up, so you can
Individual clips
take a, you could.
of but
Whoa! I caught you mid comment there. Okay. We were just wrapping up, so just telling the listeners goodbye. Thanks for being on here with me, Joel. I appreciate you hopping on for this. We'll see the comments we get, and maybe we'll try and keep this up and keep gearing it towards what listeners want to see and hear. So, any final word from you? Nope. Okay. Um, well, thanks for watching, and we enjoyed having our live crew on here commenting on things. So, thanks to everybody who watched, and have a wonderful night.